All yours.
Okay, great. Thanks, Sonia. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the 2026 International Virtual Orchard Meetup Series. Today is our third session of the year and our final session, and we will be talking about managing fruit after heat exposure, considering maturity, storage, and disorders. We're very pleased that you've decided to join us today. This series is sponsored by a national U.S. team of researchers and extension specialists working on a multi-year USDA SCRI project focused on evaluating management practices to reduce crop losses from severe cold and heat events. This large collaborative effort is known as SPARK. Many of you have probably heard of it. It's Strengthening Pear and Apple Resilience to Climate. And if you're interested in learning more about Spark, you can find that information on the website at sparkscri.com. It's on the screen as well. This is our third and final virtual orchard meetup this June. Our first meetup focused on weather patterns, forecasting, and monitoring tools. Last week, we talked about management strategies in the field relating to managing heat stress. And tonight, in our final discussion, we will focus on how we manage fruit after heat exposure, considering maturity, storage, and disorders that can arise. Before I get to our two excellent speakers who will kick our session off, I would like to introduce our organizing team. We have Bernadita Salato and Sonia Hall from Washington State University, Emily Lavely from Michigan State University, Christy Grigg McGuffin from Ontario Ministry of Food, Agriculture, and Agribusiness, Mario Miranda Sazo from Cornell University, and Daniel Weber from Penn State Extension. And my name's Lindsay King. I work for the British Columbia Ministry of Agriculture and Food. Today, we have two great speakers. They will first give their presentations, and then we'll move into a Q&A discussion. First, we will hear from Dr. Harrison Wright, a research scientist in plant and post-harvest physiology out of Kentville, and he is with Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada. We will then hear from Dr. Carolina Torres, professor and endowed chair in tree fruit post-harvest systems at Washington State University in Wenatchee. And with that, unless you have anything to add, Sonia, I will pass it over to Dr. Wright to get us started.
Thank you. I'll just share my screen. Okay, everyone can see that all right?
Looks good.
All right. Thank you for the introduction, Lindsay, and thank you for the invitation to come speak to you today about this important topic. Some of you might be curious why someone from Nova Scotia is talking on this topic. I think we're probably one of the coolest shortest season growing regions, definitely on this call. Anyway, probably North America. So I'm going to talk about last year, though, 2025 Nova Scotia drought, apple stress, maturity disorders, and storage. And there's a lot we still don't know about physiological disorders. There's a lot we know and even more that we don't know, I think. So the reason I was asked to talk today is because we had a pretty significant drought last year in Nova Scotia. So that drought in perspective, here's some data. We have a great weather data set here in Nova Scotia. We've been collecting data at this center in Kemptville since 1913, daily weather precipitation with calibrated instruments. So we have daily weather going all the way back to 1913. This is how much precipitation we normally get based on broken down by month. If you look at these gray bars, that's our annual, or that's our average precipitation per month over the last 25 years. If you look at the black lines, triangles, this is how much precipitation we received last year. So just to put things in perspective, normally in Nova Scotia here in the Annapolis Valley, Nova Scotia is a bigger place, but in the Annapolis Valley, we usually get about 1.2 meters of rainfall a year, so definitely not arid. Last year, we dropped all the way down to 833 millimeters, so something short of a meter of rain. You might be thinking like, that's still more than probably most people on this call. That's a lot of rain, but it was really the timing that was an issue. Um, if you look at when we didn't receive rain last year, was on the 3 months or the 4 months that I recommend people come to Nova Scotia, which is in the summer during the growing season. So normally in the summer, so June 21st to September 22nd, we usually receive about 300 millimeters of rain. Again, that's more than some places receive in a year that are very productive horticulturally. The big difference between us and some of these other regions that are more arid is that very few of our orchards are irrigated. 9 times out of 10, it's not needed. We have usually the opposite problem. So we usually get lots of water, but last year we only received 68 millimeters over those summer months. And again, very few places are set up for irrigation. It's usually not needed. So we were down about 77%. So this was, and going back on the records, going all the way back to 1913 when we started collecting numbers, this was by far the driest summer on record. And just for context too, I should mention 2 years ago before this, 2023, we actually had our wettest growing season on record. So it's all over the place. A couple of years ago, we had, close to 2 meters of rain or something like that. And then last year we had significantly less rain. So lots of extremes. When we talk about drought, we often should talk about heat as well. So again, we have that nice long record of temperatures. And now I'm talking not about summer, but the growing season. So we define that here as April 1st to October 31st. Where did 2025 lie? It was in the top 10. It was the sixth warmest growing season on record out of 112 years. So six. To be honest, though, it didn't really seem like it was particularly warm to me. It seemed like kind of a normal summer, and it's because I have a pretty short memory, as do a lot of people, I guess. And if you went back in recent years, it could be forgiven for me thinking it seemed kind of normal, because if you look at the last few recent years, 2021, 2022, 2023, 2024, 2025. My point is they're all there. Every year we're setting new more warm season records for the growing season. So the last 5 years have all been warm. 2026, we're on track for another top 10 year in terms of heat. I should mention this is Nova Scotia heat. We need to have better records or better information about how to compare the regions that are on the call today. But for us, it was warm. So what did that do to our fruit? Nova Scotia drought impacts on apple fruit size, composition, and maturity. So I could talk about a lot of cultivars, but our number one cultivar that we like to grow here in Nova Scotia is our Honeycrisp. So in terms of apple size, Honeycrisp are usually pretty large fruit here in Nova Scotia. Too big. I give them to my kids and they only eat half of it, but they always go for those really big ones. In 2024, which is a pretty normal year, and well, it was a warm year, but it was a normal year in terms of precipitation. The average Honeycrisp I was taking in here at the station, I brought in several lots. I think it was like 16 lots. It was about 282 grams at optimum harvest. That's a pretty big fruit. Last year, 2025, the average size of the fruit I was taking in was 205 grams. So quite a bit smaller fruit. We lost about a third of the apple. The yields we had last year correspond to that. Yields were down roughly 30% because of small fruit size, not because of less fruit. So very small apples for us coming in. Still 205 grams, still a decent sized apple. But in terms of Brix, if you look in the literature, it's kind of hard to predict. There's so many factors that go into how a drought can affect a woody perennial like an apple tree. There's a lot of history with the tree, and it has a lot to do with the environment as well. In terms of sugars, though, in 2024, this is about an average amount of sugars for us. Sugars were about 10.7 degrees Brix, so 10.7%. In 2025, the sugars were really high. So they can concentrate those sugars. That doesn't always happen in a drought in the literature, but they're up about 31%. So we had much smaller fruit. The sugars became concentrated. Just to put that in perspective, to know what that means, if you were to look at the Brix in a can of Pepsi, it's about 11.7 degrees Brix. So it was more sugar than if those of us who like a can of Pepsi. Not nearly as good for you. I do mention you did feel like you needed to brush your teeth afterwards. I saw some sites that were actually 16 or 17 degrees Brix. So these are extremely sweet apples. I like to think in absolute terms too, in terms of the physiology of the tree and the physiology of the fruit. So if we correct for the size of the fruit, the smaller size in the fruit, how much sugar was the tree actually pumping out to these fruit on the tree? So in 2024, there's about 30.2 grams of sugar in that fruit. compared to 2025, where we had just short of 29 grams. So it wasn't much difference. After we corrected for size, the amount of photosynthetates and sugars coming out from those leaves and from the tree out into the apples were only down a little bit. So I do know the trees had shut down a little bit. They don't often shut down here in Nova Scotia because of heat or drought, and they shut down a little bit. So we probably had a little less photosynthesis, especially late in some of those hot days towards the end of the summer. On the flip side, every day was a sunny day. So we had more photosynthesis. So we had less photosynthesis on one hand, but then we had more photosynthesis on the other hand. So in the end, it didn't make a big difference in our sugar levels in the tree. Also, for the record, we also measured the sugar levels in the trees themselves, how much was in the wood and stuff, and they were through the roof, very, very high sugar levels. I'm not going to talk a lot about maturity rate here, but a big question last year was, are we seeing ethylene in these fruit? And the answer was yes. We saw ethylene weeks earlier than we normally do, like 3 or 4 weeks earlier than we normally can detect it. So we saw ethylene early, but it didn't really change much. So normally in terms of not changing much, we saw it early. It stayed low for weeks. It was detectable. Normally we can't even detect it. We could detect it last year, 3 weeks early at least. And it stayed low. And then we got to days started short and stuff. And then the climacteric happened at about the normal time as it usually does. So those ethylene levels took off and starches started to convert to sugars rapidly and that sort of thing. So it was there early, and then it didn't really change when the climacteric was, we found. So what's the literature say? So everyone was wondering, how are these fruit going to store last year? This is a summer like we had never seen. I sometimes said that these are probably the driest trees in North America right now because we don't irrigate. Most of us aren't set up for irrigation, so we had hardly any water and we could do almost nothing about it. People were doing all sorts of crazy things like hauling water in tanks, and some people were able to irrigate, but that was in the minority. So there's lots in the literature. Um, Although it's all over the place. So in terms of ambrosia fruit, I know ambrosia, soft scald, and heat and drought is a big issue. Peter Toivonen at AAFC in Summerland, now retired, and now Xiao Tang Yang out of Summerland is carrying on some of this work. Years ago, he came across he discovered that drought late in the season really enhanced soft scald and ambrosia fruit. It was kind of serendipity at first. He was playing around with reflective mulches, and he had different mulches. Some of them were permeable, some of them were impermeable. And he found out some of those impermeable mulches, it would rain and the water would just sit on top of the mulch and then it would evaporate. It wouldn't go into the soil. Those blocks and those trials had very high soft scald levels. So he started playing around with the idea of irrigation late in the season and the timing and how much water you needed to mitigate the soft scald and ambrosia. For the record, I've been doing work on apples I've been associated with storage trials for at least 20 or at least 25 years, I guess. And I had never seen soft scald ambrosia in my life. We grow a lot of ambrosia here, and never to date had I ever seen soft scald. It's the number one disorder, and ambrosia in the Okanagan storage disorder, but here in Nova Scotia, our number one disorder is senescent breakdown, and I had never seen soft scald and ambrosia fruit before. Um, Switching to Honeycrisp, again, lots of studies on this. Here's one from 2009. I call it more of a survey, I guess, not a trial per se, but a study. So this was from Ontario, Maine, over a number of years, and they found there's a negative correlation with fruit and sugars. So that made us feel better. That means so more sugar, less soft scald, or less sugar, more soft scald. We had really high sugar, so I thought, well, maybe we'll be okay. But they also found negative correlation with precipitation at the end of the growing season, so 90 to 120 days after full bloom. In other words, lower rain during that period, more soft scald. So that made us nervous. There's a similar study, some of the same authors, even bigger. Again, a study, I should say a survey, even bigger, more regions. None of them are particularly arid regions, I will note though. Some same authors, some different authors. A few years later, they found correlations between for soft scald and Honeycrisp. They found a positive correlation between. They were looking at the full bloom that the time between full bloom and the 10 millimeter stage. Wet, cool conditions increase its soft scald. They also found a positive correlation with warm, not hot, but warm temperatures at 50 to 80% final fruit size. Did not mention much about late stage drought in this study, so maybe they just didn't have drought. Maybe it had drought and didn't make a difference. It's hard to say. Multiple factors are at play is the point I'm trying to make here. Then we came to the anecdotal last year. So last year, also 2025, there's a funny story we got out of New Zealand, and they actually came here to try and discuss soft scald and drought with us, this large grower. And they were having they thought their Honeycrisp like us here in Nova Scotia, they thought they were getting too big and they want to get the size down. They also irrigate there, and so they thought, well, a good way to keep the size down is we just won't irrigate the last part, that 90, 120 days after full bloom, and that will keep the size down, which it did. And then they shipped off the fruit and they exploded in soft scald. They had soft scald like they'd never seen before. So this goes back to that Peter Toivonen story or work that he did on ambrosia. Similar drought late in the season caused lots of soft scald and Honeycrisp. Um, so again, we saw that. So just to sum this all up, what we know, I'd say correlations. We have lots of correlations. They're numerous. There's several studies on it. A lot of them are highly significant, so we know these factors are playing a role. However, most of them also have very low predictability. So we know it's a factor, but we know it's only one of many factors. That means that one factor only explains a tiny bit of why we see soft scald. So we know it's significant, we know it's important, but at the same time, we know it's only one little piece of the puzzle. So a lot of these correlations that we're seeing in some of these surveys and studies, not to disparage those studies, but they're adding to our knowledge, but they're not very predictable. We can't say for certain whether we're going to have soft scald after that season based on what we know so far. And also lots of anecdotal accounts. This is the one that really made us nervous. I'd heard Dr. Torres talk several times over the last couple of years, and the first time I heard it, so she was talking about again out of Washington State, much more arid, much hotter than we are here in Nova Scotia. And this is growing season effects a result of temperature preconditioning before cold storage in Honeycrisp apples. So we precondition all our fruit. We aggressively precondition them. We precondition them at 15 to 20 degrees Celsius, warmer than anyone else does it. We do that for a full week. And then we saw this work out of Washington State, and I had never heard of this. I remember, like I said, I started reaching out to people like, did I hear this right? And eventually I reached out to Dr. Torres and said, is this for real? Because I've been a part of at least a dozen or so, or more, a couple dozen preconditioning trials on Honeycrisp. Without fail, it always reduces soft scald. It always reduces soggy breakdown. We have usually more soggy breakdown issues than soft scald, but anyway, it's always worked for us. And then we saw this out of Washington, and we saw hot, arid, maybe correlated with preconditioning actually increasing soft scald. Anyway, so last year, this made us quite nervous. We weren't sure. Should we precondition? This is our driest season on record. There's a few Honeycrisp trees growing with this little water. The big question was, should we precondition? So another factor, we looked at all those pre-harvest temperature environmental factors that affect some of these heat storage disorders and drought storage disorders. But we did work here over a decade ago now on how harvest timing also impacts storage disorders. So it made me think like exactly what stage did they harvest those fruit, and is it the same between years, and what did they hold the same and what didn't they? So here's a study, like I said, from over 10 years ago. Determination of the optimal harvest boundaries for Honeycrisp fruit using a new chlorophyll meter. So we were using this DA meter, measures chlorophyll in the skin, and we were tying everything to that. We measured all the fruit maturity parameters, starch, ethylene, acidity, sugars, and then also looking at the storage disorders over time after we put them in storage. So I'm just going to unpack this plot here quickly. So we harvested Honeycrisp over multiple years at multiple sites. It was 8 or 9 sites, and I believe it's 3 years. And we harvested them over 2 months here in Nova Scotia. So a wide range of harvest weeks. And it started like in late August, which is like a month earlier than we normally harvest Honeycrisp. And then it went into November, which is like a month later than we normally harvest our Honeycrisp. And then we looked at the DA meter, and then we looked at what kind of storage disorders we got when we put them into cold storage. We just put them in RA at 3.5 degrees Celsius with no delayed cooling to see what kind of disorders expressed. And so we started looking at the disorders, and a lot of things popped out to us, which I thought were very interesting. So first of all, bitter pit, we have reduced bitter pit issues here in Nova Scotia for the most part. And you can see that here. We can see bitter pit levels are quite high when we harvest really early. Those high numbers you see there, that's like late August, September. These are times that we consider too early to harvest. If we did harvest, we get bitter pit. We don't harvest until end of September, early October, and then there's almost no bitter pit issues there. So if we harvest too early, we get bitter pit. If we wait, bitter pit disappears and the fruit look good. But then if we wait too long, we get another disorder. We call it senescent breakdown. It's just like a diffuse sprouting of the flesh. It goes right to the peel. It's associated with maturity in the fruit. So now we know if we harvest too early, we get bitter pit. We have harvest too late, we get senescent breakdown. There's a 2 week window right in the middle there that is perfect for harvesting Honeycrisp. And it correlates with 0.59 and 0.36 on the DA meter. So when we're in between those levels, we get very little bitter pit, very little senescent breakdown. So that was good. And then we started looking at chilling disorders, though. So soft scald and low temperature breakdown, also called soggy breakdown. If we look at the soft scald, this is a problem because we have soft scald. It's not early. It kind of gets better late, but it's right in the middle of our optimal harvest window. So that's not good. And then soggy breakdown. We get more soggy breakdown than this normally, but these 3 years it seemed to be good. You can see just outside that harvest window, and we harvest a lot just outside the harvest window. It's always a scramble to get the fruit in time. And at some point, the storage operators, shut you down, but they'll take in some of those mature fruit, and a lot of those fruit are coming in just under that optimum harvest. So we see it peak, the soggy breakdown there. It actually gets better when they get really old. Some people think it gets worse, or maybe in some places it does, but for us here in Nova Scotia, the worst is just outside that mature window, and then it actually gets better. But then we have the problem with senescent breakdown. So, but those two chilling disorders, of course, we precondition for those. And I said we precondition aggressively. And at least for the last couple of decades in Nova Scotia, it almost brings those disorders to close to zero if you precondition really properly. For a number of years, a lot of other places they'll precondition at maybe 10 or 15 degrees Celsius in Ontario and New York. I think that's a recommendation in Washington as well in BC. Um, we got into issues when we only preconditioned at 10 degrees, so we try and precondition a little higher. So we're going to wrap this up soon. 2025 key questions regarding apple strawberry at harvest. So we had these questions at harvest, and we had two burning questions. One, is there going to be heightened risk of soft scald this year in ambrosia, and are we going to see soft scald on ambrosia for the first time ever? Are we going to see it in Honeycrisp, which we sometimes get but not often? So those are the burning questions there. In terms of the literature, we had hide bricks going for us. That seemed to suggest we wouldn't have soft scald as much, but we also had these drought conditions, which is linked with soft scald. The second question, which this is a harder question to answer and required a decision to be made, and that is preconditioning recommended for reducing soft scald in a warm, drought-impacted year? I should say in Nova Scotia, because a warm year for us, again, maybe not be warm for other people. So that was a question where we actually had to make a decision. In the end, not that everyone was listening to me, but I said, I think we should precondition them. It's always worked before. If it's not broke, don't fix it. Anyway, we thought we should precondition it. So 2025 drought storage year, what did we find? It was one of the worst soft scald years that we've had for quite a while. It's the worst one I've seen. Lots of soft scald. You didn't hear about it though, and I'll get to that. So ambrosia, yes, I did see one or two soft scald fruit in ambrosia. More external CO2 damage, and there's only a little bit of that, but it's the first time we'd ever seen it. So obviously there's some sort of link, confirming what they see in Okanagan and ambrosia there. So I actually brought in like actually 16 lots of ambrosia. I didn't see a single one of those fruit. I brought them in at peak maturity, and I didn't see anything in those. But at some of the storage operators, they showed me some fruit that they had brought in. It was the first time most of them had seen it as well. So a little bit of soft scald in the ambrosia. So Honeycrisp, they were a disaster. These are unconditioned. Well, if you didn't precondition, they were a disaster. So you can see some of these fruit, extreme soft scald. I'd never seen it form so quickly. I saw soft scald forming in 2 weeks. We put them into storage, and within 2 weeks, I would see them brown. The complete soft scald. There's only like a little bit of nice tissue on the ends of some of these fruit. Some good fruit in there still, but a lot of bad fruit. Harvest timing, just like we showed before, was still a factor. So I had taken in some fruit, about almost like about 10 lots in the last week of September. We were seeing about 30% soft scald on those fruit. And then I brought another lot, did another trial. This was a preconditioning trial I did, and the first week of October. And the soft scald at that point had dropped to 17%. So we still saw that connection with harvest timing, even though there was pressure there. We still saw that relationship with harvest timing as well. So in terms of did preconditioning work here in Nova Scotia, yes, worked like a charm. I took in 8 lots that those ones that had 17% soft scald. We preconditioned them. We had 0% soft scald. So obviously It wasn't hot enough to get some of the effects we're seeing in other places of the world, I guess. So yeah, that part worked out. We didn't hear about there being a big soft scald issue in Nova Scotia last year because almost everyone preconditions their fruit. There was a bunch of people who had farmyard stands and stuff like that who just put them in the cold and try and market them very quickly. They had a lot of issues. But the fruit that went to the big storage operators and they preconditioned them, almost no issues in terms of soft scald or other chilling disorders. And the fruit were very clean, obviously low rot stuff because of how clean the fruit were going in. Just a very quick note to say that how different some of the regions are. These are places that grow some of the same fruit. So we have Washington. I was looking at temperatures, days that hit 100 degrees Fahrenheit. So in Washington, that's not uncommon. 3 to 10 days a year in parts of Washington is normal. Okanagan, it's occasional, not rare. Southern Ontario, New York State, that occasionally happens. And Annapolis Valley, Nova Scotia, we're one of the coolest regions here. Well, definitely the coolest region here. Almost never happens. I think the record in Nova Scotia is 38 degrees. That happened once, like 70 years ago or something like that. So very, very cool compared to these other regions. In order to learn more about how these storage disorders manifest and when we can tell whether you're going to have issues or not, I think we need to see better collaboration between some of these very warm regions and dry regions, some of these more cool regions and wet regions. Wet or a hot, dry year in Nova Scotia might be a cool, damp year in Washington State. Anyway, there's a lot of good collaborations can come here in terms of the physiology of the fruit when they come in and what they look like in some of these warmer regions, some of these cooler regions. That's it.
Excellent. Thanks very much, Dr. Wright. You helped us with our introduction for Dr. Carolina
Yeah.
Torres. I appreciated that.
Yeah.
So, up next, we have Dr. Carolina Torres from Washington State University. I know she's on here. Oh, there
I'm
she is.
here. I'm here. I'm here. I did listen to everything. That's great. Let's see. Do you see my? Okay,
Yes, we
you
do.
do. Okay, perfect. Oops. I didn't start in the first one. Okay. Um, Thank you for talking about this, Harrison. That was great. And yes, I mean, we are in a totally different climate here, and I'm going to show you some of that data. And just to wrap up the preconditioning trial, on normal years, you do here in my own, trials, I did see an effect,
Oh, sorry to
positive.
interrupt. I think you need to, you're not in presentation mode. I'm not sure if
Oh, wait.
we're
Oh, you know
on
what?
a different
Swap,
screen.
swap, swap. Okay, got it. There.
Not yet. We're still on slide 19.
Ooh, stop share. Let's see. Let's see. Oops. Weird. And show. I'm gonna end this show. All right. Let me try again. Okay, did you see it now?
Yes, we do.
Okay.
That's great.
Okay, perfect. So yeah, I mean, in a normal year, I'm gonna go like this normal. We do see a good effect of preconditioning. And the problem is that we have, as you showed, many not normal years nowadays. So that is the issue. And to start, what I'm going to show you today, I just want to remind you all, but you all know this, apple quality does depend on many different factors. We talked about climate, but of course, orchard management, crop load is huge. The position of the fruit on the tree is another one, that when you pick and harvest at one time only, you don't have different picks, then you do see a mixture of maturities on your bin. Training and canopy management, critical, vigor, macro minerals, ratios and content on the fruit related to vigor, nutrition. And then, of course, harvest maturity is another critical one for post-harvest. And after that, storage conditions. And really, this issue comes really apparent because we store apples and pears very long time, 12 months nowadays, and we want that to happen for organic and conventional fruit. So, organic much more critical because we don't have any ethylene blocker treatment allowed. So we have to do a very good job on harvest time to be able to keep those apples for 10 months, 11 months until they reach consumers. So then what happens is a lot of the post-harvest issues and disorders that you see really have a big, the onset of these disorders have their root in pre-harvest, a lot of them. And the only thing you're doing afterwards is imposing another sets of stress. So they are stressed when they have heat. It's an extreme heat and low relative humidity when they're growing in the tree. And then after you pick them, you put them in very low temperature. And so here we have the beautiful Honeycrisp that taught us the importance of how to manage differently a chilling sensitive apple, which we didn't think that exists in the past. So now we have to care about how the apple and the fruit grow in the orchard. What are the environmental conditions there to be able to predict or manage that fruit post-harvest the right way to minimize and mitigate some of the disorders that appear afterwards. So one of the most impactful climatic indices or variables that affect fruit at harvest and post-harvest, and I'm talking about light, high light, and high heat, and then adding on that the low temperature stress, that affects the maturation, and then afterwards, after fruit is harvested, ripening rate. So then we start questioning if those, and we've seen evidence that the current maturity indices do not correlate well to each other and to ethylene, that actually triggering ripening on a climacteric fruit like apples. And if the harvest maturity is not right, then we just go right into accelerated to senescence post harvest. And even though we're actually we're slowing metabolism using control atmosphere and then ultra low oxygen storages, then we go into other issues involving those additional stresses to low temperature, which is low oxygen and high CO2. And we're also affecting the fruit acclimation to cold storage, the fruit stress level. And then when we affect the fruit stress level, we're affecting all the biochemistry associated to physiological disorders. So what we do practically in a warmer season, people harvest earlier because they use the traditional maturity indices recommended for each variety, so they can harvest 7 to 15 days prior normal dates. But really, when that fruit that was harvested correctly according to maturity indices, they go into storage and then they see unexpected results in fruit quality when they still have to keep that fruit for long term in storage. So so that is something that got me to work on this prior to US in Chile, and still very stressful environment, dry and hot. And so now in Washington, the same situation. So I'm just going to make a brief description of some of the disorders we see with heat. The first one is, of course, sunburn. We also can see splitting and cracking and checking in some varieties. Definitely, over maturity is part of those issues, and also in the case of checking rain before harvest and soil water. And also low and high relative humidity during fruit growth. That would be checking. Over maturity more related to splitting. Then the other thing we see is fruit that gets sun stress and not necessarily sunburn, and they go into storage, and susceptible varieties like Granny Smith develop sun scald, and Fuji's develop stain. And there is no control for this. And it's not, it appears when the fruit is in cold storage, not when it's in shelf life. 1-MCP doesn't do anything to it. No crop protectant works on these. And so when there is a lot of stressful conditions in the field and mild sunburn and no sunburn fruit go into storage, you will see sun scald start to appear after 2 weeks in cold storage. And the earlier it appears, if the sunburn is more severe. So that the fruit that has mild and no sunburn but sun stress, this disorder will appear in a month, a month and a half. You will start seeing sun scald on that fruit. Pears can also have this disorder. DPA doesn't do anything because this is not superficial scald. And so the beauty of this disorder, sun scald, is that it correlates perfectly with the level of sun stress and sunburn. So on top of the pictures on top, you have different levels of sun exposure, shaded fruit, exposed exposed to sunlight, mild sunburn, moderate sunburn, severe sunburn, and below that, the level, severity, and presence of sun scald. So the fruit that has been in the shade has never developed sun scald. So that is a good thing because we can identify it really well. Where does it come from? And yeah, how to prevent it. Anything that will prevent and reduce the stress level of sunburn in the field will have a positive effect on sun scald development post-harvest. On the tray on the right, that's how it looks, that Granny Smith, and that can be confused with superficial scald. So because it's not, you will not control it with 1-MCP or with DPA. So it just has no control. So here you have 2 trays, right? Sun scald on the left, superficial scald on the right. And when you're in a QC lab, in a packing house, in a company, you learn about this and you study this, but this can be really confusing. It might look like you did something wrong on the fruit, and it's really 2 different disorders with 2 different onset variables that make the fruit susceptible to it. Superficial scald appears mostly on shaded fruit. Sun exposed side of the fruit does not develop superficial scald. So it's the opposite in terms of the metabolism associated with its development on the fruit. So diagnostic is really important to take the measures to reduce it, not on the time that you see it, but on your next year fruit. The other issues with hot climates is lenticel and pit issues. And here you also need diagnostic because you have to differentiate those caused by nutrition problems, deficiency, or imbalances between normally calcium and other macromolecules, magnesium, potassium, nitrogen, and that's 2 times magnesium. And then the ones that are more related and associated with abiotic stress and post-harvest management and processing, like lenticel breakdown disorder. It is easy to diagnose this because LBD, usually it's present mostly on the peel. So if you actually take the skin off or the peel off, you won't see the brown pits underneath in the flesh, as you would see when it's more of a nutritional issue on the fruit. So there are some good things about how to differentiate them. LBD is mostly concentrated on the lenticel of the apple, and it appears mostly, not all of it, but mostly on fruit that has been packed. So after going through precising and after going through packaging. So it will take between 48 hours, 72 hours to start appearing, and it will continue for at least a month afterwards when the fruit is going through the transit and then going to the cold chain. supply chain. Diagnostic, again, very important. Bruising, it's another one that some years fruit it's really susceptible to bruising. And yes, we know that mechanical properties of the cultivar, it's important, right? The tissue, the texture and the anatomy of that tissue, it is cultivar dependent, but it's definitely associated to advanced maturity. The more advanced maturity, the bigger that bruise volume. So the older the apple gets, the more bruises and the larger bruises they get, because those intercellular spaces increase in size. So as the fruit is in storage and the fruit was already harvested, the variety is prone to it. The harvest was not at the optimal time. That's susceptible to bruising will increase as the fruit gets older in storage. And then the other one, big one related to harvest maturity, is senescence related disorder. Here you see all these different types of browning: core browning, diffuse browning, radial browning, and they appear in a lot of different varieties. You're seeing Fuji's here, Honeycrisp, Pink Ladies, or Crisp Pinks, very susceptible to it. And the Crisp Pink has 3 types: radial, diffuse, and both in the same apple. One radial more associated to maturity at harvest, and diffuse, it's a chilling, more of a chilling issue on this apple. But really, those factors get mixed when those browning events appear post harvest. Sun exposure also causes some water core here, right underneath the tissue that was exposed to the sun, with or without symptoms on the outside of the fruit. We saw this in 2021. This is a 2009 event in Chile, but I have seen it here, especially after that the huge heat wave in 2021. We saw some browning in the flesh right after harvest, caused by sun stress. Okay, so now I'm going to go into growing environment versus storage outcomes. And after all these years, I've seen the changing climate and the effect on fruit quality in Chile and then here. I decided that instead of taking 20 orchards, 25 orchards, I'm going to actually follow blocks of fruit, commercial fruit, year after year. So we started in 2019 with a Washington Tree for Research Commission grant, and then continue with an RA 22-25. And now we have one SCRI, and we're working with the same blocks. Because what I want is a lot of years, we harvest fruit from the same commercial block, the same group of trees. We have canopy sensors that record temperature and relative humidity. And then we apply different post-harvest systems for long-term storage. We also condition the fruit at harvest. So the preconditioning trials were separate from the trials here that we actually submit fruit to different cold chain scenarios. Okay, so to start, what went on here, I'm only showing you a little bit of data, not a lot, because this is a big project. But here we have 2020 until 2024. 2020, we had smoke at harvest, 200 PM 2.5 in Quincy, one of the blocks, and it was September. 2021, which is the red line on every graph, it was the big heat wave in June, July, and we had warm nights that year. 2022, it's the one that I'm going to show you data for. There was cold and freezing temperatures during bloom, 2 heat waves closer to harvest than the one in 2021, cooler nights, cooler than 2021, but not that cool, okay? And those are the blue lines. Then the 2023, we had a warm spring, a higher number of cells, denser fruit. We can tell that commercially because those bins weight more or weight less depending on the density of that fruit. And we also had cooler weather close to harvest. 2024 was similar to 23 with cooler temperatures at the end. So now let's just focus. In 2022, firmness, this is starting 5 weeks, 6 weeks before harvest. Harvest time is 0. So we see here, this is Honeycrisp, a steep decline on firmness from 5 weeks before harvest until harvest that year of the 2 heat waves, 2022. 2021, the year of the big heat wave, that firmness was low much earlier, right? Because that heat wave was at the end of June, last week of June, 1st of July, and that firmness was low all along until harvest. Okay. The other thing in 2022, very stressful year again, we had a higher rate of starch degradation, right? You see that from the 3 weeks before harvest until harvest. Fruit was harvested with almost starch of 6, fully degraded. Remember, I also have to tell you that that year the fruit didn't color, so people was waiting for that fruit to color to pick, which is a reality of many different apple cultivars. Ethylene wise, that year at harvest, fruit had a lot of ethylene. I mean, here you see 50, 30 and 50 and up to 60 parts per million of ethylene, internal ethylene concentration, which is huge. It is very big. Malic acid, the lowest levels of malic acid was in 2021 and 2022. And that is very important for long-term storage because it's responsible for flavor. You can have high sugars, but if you have low acids, that fruit doesn't taste good. That's what happens to Fuji regularly in long-term storage. So the fruit not only tastes like nothing, right, but also cardboard sometimes, and all the volatiles that it gets in the apple from storage. Okay, so just to show you temperatures, what am I talking about? On top, the left here, you have 2022 temperature in one of the blocks, 104 Fahrenheit. The yellow arrows are the pre-harvest sampling that we did, and the green one is the harvest time of that fruit. The red line is the daily maximum temperature. And then the green one is the daily minimum temperature. And I only want to show you that in 2022, the fruit had at harvest high starch index, so degraded starch, high ethylene concentration, low TA, and low background color. So more yellow than green. So in 2024, that fruit still, temperatures were much lower, but still fruit in that had low acidity, but low ethylene. In 2023, temperatures were not extreme at all. We had high temperatures during bloom, as you can see here on the left of those graphs. But fruit had a lot of ethylene at the time of harvest and low acidity. Okay, so this is harvest maturity for that fruit. Below you have the harvest date. It starts in 2019, but we're not going to see that data. Then 2020, 2021. And so the data I'm showing you is 22, 23, and 24. And as you see here, in 22, people was waiting for that fruit to color. So it was harvest 10 days after normal date of harvesting that fruit, which is around September 9, September 11. That year, fruit was harvested in September 22. So consequences. Firmness, 9 pounds, very low firmness compared to 23, 24. Starches, not that, solid solids, not high. It was 10 bricks. It was a very warm temperature, warm season. The starch was 4.4 in one block and 5.9 in the other one. A lot of ethylene at the time of harvest, 17, 39 parts per million. And here you can see respiration of the fruit was pretty high compared to other years. One thing I have to say is the DA meter, which measures the absorbance difference index here. The higher the number, the more green background color. The fruit had pretty good green background color compared to, for example, 2024. So one thing that I already have seen in the past, though the correlation of those different maturity indices, it doesn't stay, it's not something that will be consistent over the years. And it doesn't connect with ethylene production and concentration of the fruit either. So that is tricky because sometimes you don't see starch in the starch moving, the starch scale. And then you're waiting for that to happen, but everything else in the fruit is happening. Fruit is producing ethylene, chlorophyll, it is degrading. The fruit is getting softer, but you don't see changes in starch. Or the background color stays green longer, that chlorophyll doesn't degrade fast enough, and the fruit is softening, and that starch is degrading fast. So that can happen, and that's why, in general, recommendation is do not pick one maturity index, but you have to pick more than two, hopefully, 2 or 3, depending on the variety. The problem is the new varieties, they're pretty firm. They have good amount of acids. And really the only thing like WA38 or Cosmic Crisp, the only maturity index we looked at is starch index. And actually that starch index moves through towards maturity, moves differently at different rates depending on the environmental conditions. Okay, so this is an example here. This is the correlation between internal ethylene concentration on the y-axis and the starch index in the x-axis. The higher the number of starch index, the more degraded that starch is, right? So in 22, 1 week before harvest, the fruit was fruit that has 4 starch index had low ethylene, but harvest happened when the fruit had almost 6 starch index. In 23, harvest happened before the fruit had 4, but that fruit already had a good amount of ethylene. And in 24, the starch 4 had less ethylene than the fruit in 23. And harvest occurred later. So here you just have an example that, the same starch index level will be together, or will be happening with different ethylene levels on the fruit. And I have to talk about ethylene because everything then that happens post-harvest, it will have ethylene involved one way or another. And so the commercial harvest also happens at different starch index levels in this variety, which is Honeycrisp, and different levels of ethylene. Since 2019, since I've been here, Honeycrisp is harvested with ethylene most of the years. It's just different levels of ethylene at harvest. The most stressful year, it has much more ethylene at harvest than in less stressful years. Okay, so then the storage regime we applied, just focus on Honeycrisp here. I'm going to show a little bit of Gala, but not much. We condition fruit 7 days at 50 degrees Fahrenheit, 10 degrees C. Then we put fruit in controlled atmosphere, 2% oxygen, 0.5% CO2, regular air. Fruit, Honeycrisp, all of it is stored at 37 degrees Fahrenheit. Then we applied DCA, starting with 2% of oxygen and going down up to the 0.8, 0.5% oxygen, depending on the chlorophyll fluorescence and respiratory quotient to move that DCA. And then we applied 2 weeks in air or 4 weeks in air to simulate a supply chain scenario for Washington fruit. After each of those pullouts, we do shelf life of 7 days at room temperature. This fruit was stored 9 months plus 4 weeks in 1 day or 7 day shelf life. So what happened in the most warm season for Honeycrisp? Well, first of all, here you see firmness, and you see that firmness declining before harvest, pretty good. But after you put that fruit in storage, regardless of the storage regime, that firmness stays pretty steady. You don't have to worry about firmness of Honeycrisp, meaning 13 pounds, 14 pound, that doesn't change. The storage condition doesn't really change that at all. You do see differences between storage regimes and ethylene production. That is the small graph on the right and top right. You see ethylene production is much higher in RA, regular air storage, than in CA, and the lowest in DCA. So the lower the oxygen, the less ethylene production on the fruit. And then what happened with the chlorophyll degradation? Not much in this case. You don't see differences between the different storage regime on the rate of degreening of that fruit in storage. It stays pretty much a little lower than at harvest, but not much difference between the storage regimes. What happened with soft skull and soggy breakdown? These are averages. The numbers here of soft skull and soggy is averages incidence for all the storage regimes. So I'm not showing you differences between them. So the two blocks, W42 or 802, you have the season 1920, 2021, 21, 22, 22, 23. Now, the stressful year that I've been talking about is 22. So the storage season is 23. And you see that season, we had the highest soft scald, 3.6% incidence average for mostly the C802 block. So we still see some block dependent response here. That is 6 months plus 4 weeks and 7 days. Then we see 9 months plus 4 weeks, still 3.1%. But we do see a huge amount of, I'm going to say huge amount of soggy breakdown, 7.7% for that same block, which was 802. We usually see soggy breakdown associated to soft scald, but not the opposite. So soft scald can be alone with no soggy breakdown, but soggy breakdown is usually more than 90% of the times associated to soft scald. Okay, so this is 2022. On your left, you see bitter and blotch pit incidents here, 3 months to 9 months for the two blocks that I'm showing, 42 and 802. So one thing we found, bitter pit is block dependent. The different color bars are the three different storage system, control atmosphere, DCA, and RA. Not much difference between them. As you can see here. On the right, you see decay. And here right away, you can see the green bars much higher than the other two. Green bar is DCA. DCA fruit had a huge amount of decay, and I'm going to show you in a minute why. So we see a strong block effect on bitter pit and negative effect of DCA on decay, and also some block effect too. Why? Because the fruit was destroyed. Here you have it. The fruit had a lot of soft scald, especially in 802 block, and a lot of soggy breakdown, especially in 802 block, and a lot of CO2 damage or cavities, especially, well, the two blocks had equal amount, but 802 that already had a lot of soggy breakdown and a lot of soft scald, you could see that fruit is worthless, right? So what happened in 22? We had late harvest. That fruit entered storage with accelerated maturity. Earlier, the senescence on that fruit, higher chilling sensitivity. It was conditioned, this fruit, and higher CO2 sensitivity. So we think that in this case, of course, we had differences between storage regimes. So low oxygen, we're not sure if it was caused by low oxygen levels or CO2 oxygen ratios. We have confounding symptoms here. And that is something that, we still need to study a little bit more. So here on the right, you have high soggy breakdown and CO2 injury in warmer years. In cooler years, we got 0 to 2% of soggy breakdown versus 40 to 50% block dependent in warmer years, extreme warmer years like 2022. In the case of soggy breakdown, we saw differences between years and blocks. Cool years and site had more soft scald, but that was not always the case. And it was an interaction with maturity and a storage type. So we still are there with our conclusions until 2026 today. Well, what happened with Gala? Well, Gala, I'm going to move to Gala very quick. Very different from Honeycrisp, but I want to show you that in 2022, Gala store at 0 to 1 degree C. The browning on Gala is mostly associated with senescence. That's the first thing. So we did not see the impact that we saw in Honeycrisp soggy breakdown on Gala. That wasn't the response. But here in the complicated year 22, we saw a lot of browning, 60% on air storage after 9 months of storage. In 23-24, less stressful year, at 0 and 1 degree C, that browning was no more than 38%, so much less. And it was higher in DCA storage when we store that fruit at higher temperature, 3 degrees C, which is what's recommended for the East Coast, for Gala, out of the Cornell work. For us, it hasn't worked for 3 years. The 3 degrees C has more browning than 0 or 1, or the same browning. So you see here, 24, 21, there are differences between storage regimes. Overall, we still got 60-some% browning at 0, 1 degree C compared to 3 degrees C. But also puzzling is that we're getting more browning on fruit store and DCA on some instances when they're stored at higher temperature than when they're stored at lower temperature. So there's some things we still need to go into it. But definitely a warmer year, not always though, leads to more browning because of the earlier and faster senescence of that stressed fruit in storage. Not always though. And there are differences between sites. So final remarks, hot weather and extreme events significantly alter fruit quality and storage potential, affecting the ripening rate pre and post harvest and inducing physiological disorder development. Understanding that those have a multifactorial origin. We do need new maturity indices in order to predict and forecast better. And then apply appropriate post-harvest systems. We also see some relationship with CO2 sensitivity, especially in Honeycrisp, that might be driven by seasonal weather. We just need to understand how and why that happened. So after heat event, as a recommendation, don't delay harvest and consider using PGRs, ethylene blockers, in order to delay and delay maturity and harvest at the right time when you have big acreage. Proper cooling, especially non-chilling sensitive cultivars. You have to get that fruit cold to reduce metabolism as fast as you can. And then be on time with 1-MCP applications. The later you do it, the less effective 1-MCP will be. And then, of course, if you have affected lots and sites, you should target those for short and mid-term storage length. You don't go for long-term storage in fruit that has been stressed in the field, or you got to pick them later. And you always have to use control atmosphere. I'm still going to push for lower oxygen levels, especially not Honeycrisp. And do not use ultra low oxygen levels in Honeycrisp, although your sensor might tell you that, because we've seen sensitivity to those conditions when the fruit is highly stressed. Okay, as a summary here, these are potential effects of heat. For apple, pear, and sweet cherry, less storage potential overall. Apples and pears, you might get smaller fruit, sun skull incidence, higher maturity rates. For apples, you might see internal browning, corkiness, lenticel breakdown disorder, reduced 1-MCP effectiveness, high greasiness in prone cultivars, higher susceptibility to senescence-related disorder, high susceptibility to chilling injury disorders, and bitter pit. For pears, we have seen less chilling requirement to ripen post-harvest, and earlier senescent-related disorders, superficial scald for sure. So a lot of different things can go wrong when the fruit is stressed from environmental conditions in the field. Thank you so much. I can't do all of this with my big team and my awesome team. And that's all. And of course, my collaborators, Washington and Oregon, apple and pear growers and packers, always there for us. Thank you so much.
Great. Thanks very much, Dr. Torres. That was excellent. I would like to now invite our grower panelists to turn their videos on or unmute and join us. I see Paul and Garrett. Got Garrett Henry, and there's Leslie. Excellent. And we've got Thiago. Okay, let's kick off with some introductions. Can I pass it over to you, Paul, to introduce yourself and tell us about your operation?
Yeah, I'm Paul Cathcart. I'm an area manager and R&D coordinator for Washington Fruit here based in Yakima. So large vertically integrated fruit grower here in Yakima. Also sell fruit. Just been with Washington Fruit for 1 year. Prior to that, worked for Columbia Reach for 9 years as an area manager.
Great. Thank you for joining us. How about Garrett Bishop? We'll stay in Washington and then we'll move elsewhere.
I work for a chemical distributor, GS Sloan Company, and we have 40 fieldmen and work with them and their growers on plant disease diagnostics. So if there's something weird pre-harvest and post-harvest, I help figure it out. So see a lot of weird things in storage and a lot related to sun and weather.
Awesome. Thanks for joining us. Okay, over to you, Garrett Henry.
Garrett Henry. I work for Douglas Fruit Company in Pasco, Washington. We grow apples, peaches, nectarines, cherries, and we pack apples and nectarines and peaches. Our orchards are located in the Columbia Basin in South Central Washington. Yeah, and I think if you guys weren't here last time, then we farm in areas gets about 6 to 8 inches of rainfall. Generally, our winters are in the low or high 20s, and our summers are low 90s, and we do average around 10 days over 100 degrees.
Perfect. Thanks. And then Thiago, I think you're from WSU as well. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, sure. So my name's Tiago. I'm the WSU Extension Educator focusing on post-harvest pathology and physiology. So yeah, I help out packing houses and people across the state, growers too, and just kind of act as a service to see what they need more information on and go between WSU and industry.
Great, thanks. And then over to Ontario. Thanks for representing Canada, Leslie. Would you like to introduce yourself? Oh, you're muted.
Hi, I can talk maybe a little more about Eastern Canada after Harrison talked about Nova Scotia. So I'm in Southern Ontario, right near Lake Erie. We're in the middle of a of a major fish fly, mayfly emergence, which is feeds our freshwater fishery here. So, and we are having tornadoes go through the area tonight. So if my phone goes off with a warning, that's I don't think it's so much in this area, but anyways, if I disappear, that's where I went. Um, so there's 5 or 6 larger packers in Ontario that handle most of the wholesale fruit and do the long-term storage. And we do have in Southern Ontario, we have some very hot conditions occasionally during September when we're trying to pick some of the early fall apples. So I guess that's where I'm speaking from, that experience with that. I used to work in extension in Ontario. The last 8 years of my career were working with apple growers, and now I have a small fruit farm for about 35 acres on near the shore of Lake Erie.
Great to have you join us. Thanks. I will pass it over to Sonia to lead a bit of a discussion. Have any questions come in through the chat?
We do not yet have any questions in the chat, so for everyone, please feel free to add those and we'll catch those and pose them to our panelists here. But maybe we can get started, maybe going in the same order you just introduced yourselves, and just share your experiences and talk a little bit about how a hot season influences the decisions you make in terms of harvest timing and storage.
Right. I think hot season for us primarily will affect my background is primarily in growing Honeycrisp, and so the hot temperatures closer to harvest really will have a detrimental effect on fruit coloring. So your fruit may be internally maturing, but you just don't have marketable color yet, and so that pushes the harvest window back and back. Also considering that apple prices have not been great here in Washington, there's a lot more pressure to reduce the number of passes that are being made in the orchard from 3 or 4 to 2, mostly on color picking. And so that also tends to force you to wait longer and longer to pick, so you have enough fruit to do it in 2 passes instead of getting in there sooner rather than later. So I do think getting in as soon as possible and pushing the color grade as hard as possible on those hot years is really important in order to get fruit that will store for you. Normally, if you can't just put all of your Honeycrisp into short to midterm CA, right? So that's kind of the problem there. You gotta get going somewhere, and you're gonna have to pay a little extra to do some low productivity picks, I think, in order to get some storage quality fruit.
Go ahead, Garrett.
Carolina Torres mentioned about 2022 as a struggle year. The worst one I saw in my career when it came to decay was fruit that was harvested in 2017. And one of the main reasons with that, at least in Washington State, is we had a ton of smoke. So we had 2 periods where we had one that was kind of in early August for 12 days. And then a second one, so that was our gala harvest, and then a second one that was last part of August and went to September 17th. So that was 22 days where we just had really heavy smoke. People were waiting for color, and that fruit went into storage in not good shape. And one of the main reasons was we had less UV. So looking at like a 5-year average, we had some nights, some days was 54% less UV. But the biggest thing that I saw was we had certain nights that was 20 degrees higher Fahrenheit in our min temp at night. And that's huge. I mean, that's 11C. So the fruit maturity just was really ramping up, and people were waiting for color, and things didn't go into storage well. So I think that's always something to consider when you have smoke in certain regions.
Thank you. Garrett, do you have anything to Garrett Henry, do you think anything you'd like to add?
Sure. Yeah, I think that I don't spend a lot of time on the post-harvest side, being on the orchard side, but I think all the things that Carlina and I think Paul are mentioning was what we do, and we being a company ranches, we're kind of tasked to fill in the gaps where outside growers aren't putting their fruit, and so we're always targeting fruit for late term storage, because we've got to fill those gaps for the sales desk. And so we utilize, well, I would say we sample a lot. We start early and we sample often to kind of get an idea what the fruit's doing, how it's moving with, we check starches and pressures. And this also gives us, sets our timing up for Harvista. We do Harvista. We have done some retain, and I think both of those products help with internal browning issues and splits, especially on galas. And that's kind of one of our big ones, right? Galas is kind of our hard apple variety to get into the late term storage. And sometimes it's not going to be perfect. Like Paul said, we're not really making the 2 passes. We're going to go when we need to get fruit into storage. So sometimes our color is not going to be perfect, but if it's good enough and our pressures and starches start to move, we're going because we're trying to put fruit away, put fruit in a long time. So one of the issues with the warmer summers that we see is lately is trying to deal with grannies. Man, we're not getting the chilling units, and so it's pushing these grannies off later and later to try to start picking them, which is kind of pushing them into other varieties. When we used to be able to do grannies, it was kind of like a nice window we could get into them, but it's been harder and harder to get storage grannies because it's been pushing them later. And then you run into other issues with blushing and you start to see the effects of the fall heat or the fall sun intensity. You get more sunburn or yellowing of the fruit, and so I think grannies have been a bit of a tough one for us. So it's kind of in a nutshell what we're doing.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Tiago, other things you've seen in Washington?
Yeah, so luckily I'm extension. I don't have to go harvest. I don't work for packing house, so I don't have to make those difficult decisions. But I try to go around and ask around. I know this year what Garrett was talking about in terms of decay, and Carolina mentioned it too. I've heard a lot of reports from people so fruit coming out of storage right now, they've had a lot more decay this year than other years. I don't know if that's people having short memories and not, remembering stuff from 2017 or previous years, but that's come up a lot. And then I know in terms of heat-related disorders too, that there were some issues with not getting color in time and having to wait with those fruit. So then they were getting problems with internal breakdown on those fruit. But I haven't gotten many of those reports yet or gone around to ask for those.
Leslie, take us to the other side of the continent.
Well, halfway across, but
yes.
So we don't have a large system of fieldmen in Ontario. We have several large packers, but they kind of rely on the growers to do their own maturity monitoring. And most growers would use starch iodine index. A few use DA meters. Many use pressure. And so we enter harvest shortly after Labor Day in September. And we have many people looking at those 3 indices as well. There's not that many people have internal ethylene to measure. Possibly a couple of the field houses have that. But we find that a lot of in general in Ontario, 1/3 of the harvest for storage would be Gala, 1/3 would be Honeycrisp, and then 1/3 would be Ambrosia. So we're kind of working we have lots of other little retail apples. Like 40% of the Ontario apples go into the retail trade, whether they be pick your own or direct farm sales. So that's a huge market in Southern Ontario, and similar in other parts of Canada. But I like to visit those other places, but I'm not going to speak for them. Anyways, we find that people use a lot of retain, different rates of retain on their galas. And I've heard that growers tell me that they would like to be harvesting galas over 5 to 6 weeks if they could do that with the different strains, different rates of retain. And then they find that a lot of reduced cracking, waxiness and cracking on retain. Honeycrisp is preconditioned, as Carolyn was talking about, in general, and we're ramping up our Honeycrisp production to kind of fill the marketplace as well. So there's a lot of that. I think that we have a tremendous amount of sunburn and challenges during harvest. You get harvested bins, you need to get them out of the heat, you need to cover them. I know last week, I think it was Steve Brown from BC talked about not liking mylar, but I've heard of growers using their old supplies of mylar up as reflective covers on their harvested bins because we'll get sunburn in the orchard as you're bringing them out. And because many of the packers are several hours away from their storages, that there's a very good system of logistics to get harvested bins into reefer trucks and get them down the road and get them into storages and start managing the storage regime. So that's what I've observed.
You mentioned cracking. There's a question from Bruce about the cause and the remedy for microskin cracking in stored Fuji and Honeycrisp. Anyone want to take that on?
Did Bruce mean like not stem bowl in general? He means like skin cracking, I think.
Bruce, feel free to unmute and correct if that's not the case.
My comments about retain were using stem bowl cracking and gala as they get more mature. And certain strains of gala are more prone to that.
Anybody else have thoughts on the skin cracking? And that Bruce clarified that he's looking at cracking on the shoulder.
Well, we were growing.
Sorry.
Oh, go ahead.
No, it is maturity related. The stem ball ripens before than the calyx end. So it goes inside to outside, top to bottom. So that tissue before the maturity indices measure on the equator side of the apple, that is already more advanced. So you're waiting to harvest and the stem ball, the side of the shoulder cracks because those cells are more, that lamella that holds that tissue together starts degrading. So yeah, it is genetics.
So in terms of remedies, is there anything to offer?
We don't really have a big problem with most of our varieties, but when we were growing Sweet Tango, which we are no longer growing, that's a difficult apple for us. We were using the Cornell program. I think that was Mancozeb or Pencozeb and Provide, I think. And if you look it up, they came up with a program for basically it reduced some of the rusting and some of the early season cellular damage and help with elasticity of the cells early on. And that, for us, that helped a lot with the fruit finish on that particular variety. That's the only experience I have.
There are a couple of questions around maturity. The first one is, what is the possibility for adjusting the grading to compensate for these post-harvest issues in over-mature fruit? Harvesting fruit based on color, not true physiological maturity, seems to reduce predictability, quality, and storability. Anyone have thoughts on adjusting grading or the possibility of that?
Well, I did bring that up last week on the ambrosia thing, thinking that the market's asking for way more color than in most seasons, and most climate changes are almost impossible. But nobody listens to me.
Well, I think
You
that's what
know,
threw the tangle for us, is that we just couldn't hit the color parameters that they wanted with that. It was a bicolor apple for us. So
yeah, and it's fine. I'm just gonna make a comment because we're working on WA64, right? The new variety. And I think that is something that has to be said at the beginning of the release of a variety, to have those expectations be the real one. Because really, even if it's a bicolor apple, certain conditions are going to lead to very red ones and full of red, and others, just a blush. And so, yeah, so we were discussing the same thing. And once you set a base for it, you can hardly change. You can't change it. I mean, people expect and then they buy according to coverage and intensity of the color. So we are talking about that because 64 can become really red, but most of the time it doesn't because it's by color. So yeah, it is a tricky thing. And unless you use reflectant material to increase that color, I don't see another way of improving that coloration. I mean, if the temperature is not helping, it's night temperatures, then yeah, it is a tricky one.
I'll just throw in, I don't think you'd have any problem convincing any of the growers that we should harvest based off of other metrics besides color. I think the challenge is getting buyers on board with that.
Agree. And I think one thing is also kind of understand your bell curve of where you're at. Like in the past, I've seen lenticel breakdown sorter massively is a fruit maturity thing. Um, and you look at the average report, and this is Gala's, and the starch was a 2.1. You'd think that wouldn't have any issues, but luckily that packing house kept records of each individual fruit, and about 15% of it was a lot more advanced. So that's why you got lenticel breakdown disorder was just on that more mature. But the average wouldn't have told you that because it was a 2 point, it was a two, close to a two on starch.
Well, don't you think with galas that we in Ontario, we get a big age range of bloom dates and pollination, and so even at harvest, you could have like this year we had an enormous long harvest period. So I think the fruit is going to be harvested with an age range difference of 10 to 14 days, which is not great, right? So I don't know how you get rid of it, and we couldn't thin it off, so it's still out there.
And I think that's always a challenge for growers is how much you take for that first pick or that second pick. So the example I gave you was a second pick, where they had the challenges. Yep.
Yeah, I think Garrett makes a really good point about watching on your QCs, not just be watching averages, but be looking at outliers as well. And so if you're going to put something into long-term storage, just verifying that you don't have some part of that fruit that's really blown out in terms of starch, especially for gala in long-term storage. You don't want to have a bunch of F5s in there. Or not even a bunch, but just some, is enough to kind of create problems. So
Another question in the chat sort of follows up on some of this. So focusing on Gala, what is the first index for harvest decision? Is it starch index or firmness, especially thinking in heat season and years with low color development?
Well, what we do is generally pressures. I can store fruit. I can generally store fruit longer if the pressures are good, even if the starches are a little further out than we want. But if your pressures are sliding, then that's really an indicator that the fruit quality is probably not going to get you there. It's not going to probably have the legs. So, I mean, we kind of feel pressures are pretty important.
I do feel that on Gala specifically, we keep a pretty close eye on starches, both to not get in there too early, but also to know when to switch into shorter storage regimes.
I agree. In Ontario, Gala would be the starch that people would watch the most, make their early decisions on the first picks.
Very good. Anyone else have any final questions for our panelists or any of our panelists and presenters? Any final reflections as we wrap up today?
This goes back to Bruce's question about the small cracks on their shoulders, and they said that it was the Cornell program with Provide and Mancozeb. So the Provide would be useful, is used sometimes on Goldens and Matsu yellow skinned apples to prevent basically russeting, which is small cracks and stuff like that in the east, because we often have a lot of moisture during those times of skin growth, skin development, and that's where that recommendation came from. I don't know if it'll work in your climate at all, but that's how it works.
Thanks, Leslie. Any other final comments before I hand it back to Lindsay to wrap up? All yours, Lindsay.
I would actually just add one last thing. Block history should play a pretty important role also. I mean, generally, if we've been storing fruit for a lot of years with most of these growers, and we just know some blocks are going to store better than others, some varieties and some blocks. And so understanding block history is also, I think, important for storability.
Thank you.
And Garrett, what do you think contributes most to that block? I've seen that before too, and I don't really understand it.
That's a good question. Sometimes it's rootstock variety, sometimes it's soils, grower practices. Sometimes it's that's a good question. Microclimates, I don't know, but we have some blocks that we just know we don't store.
Absolutely. So yeah, interesting.
Very good. Well, Lindsay, I will hand it back to you.
Thanks, Sonia. Always great to glean as much as we can from these panels. So thanks, everyone. And a big thank you to Dr. Wright and Dr. Torres for sharing your research and insights with us, and also to our grower panelists for contributing your experiences and very valuable insights to this discussion. We really appreciate it. Before you leave, please take a few minutes to complete the short survey that is on the screen in front of you. This is very important to us because your feedback will help us improve future virtual orchard meetups and make sure we pick topics that are most useful to you. And this concludes our June virtual orchard meetup series. Thanks very much to the Spark team for being our sponsor for this, our organizing committee, and everyone who joined us. And I see that Sonia popped the link to the survey in the chat as well. And we very much appreciate your participation, and we hope to see you at future virtual orchard meetups. And if anyone from the organizing committee would like to add anything here, please feel free. But with that, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.